One of our early studies found that on a neural level, the patterns of brain activity that arise when people think about their future selves looks a lot like the patterns of activity that arise when people think about another person. If we think about our future selves as if they are other people, then by definition, any decision that we make right now that has a consequence later is going to happen essentially to another person.
Today, I'm joined by Hal Hershfield, Professor of Marketing, Behavioral Decision-Making and Psychology at UCLA's Anderson School of Management. Hal is best known for his groundbreaking research on how we relate to our future selves and why that relationship shapes the choices we make today. From how much we save for retirement, to the risks we take in our careers, to how we look after our health and well-being. He's the author of Your Future Self, How to Make Tomorrow Better Today, a book that translates decades of scientific findings into practical ways we can bridge the gap between who we are now and who we're becoming. Hal's work has been featured everywhere from the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal to NPR and the Harvard Business Review, and he's been at the forefront of exploring how new technologies, including AI, can help us build a stronger connection to our future selves. Hal, thank you so much for being here. Absolute treat.
Hey, Duncan, thank you so much. I'm really excited to have the conversation with you.
One interesting thing, I think this was actually a finding that you found like way back, like in the early days, but one interesting finding from your research is that people often treat their future selves as another person. Could you explain the psychology behind why this might be?
Yeah, it is kind of an interesting finding. One of our early studies found that even on a brain level, on a neural level, the patterns of brain activity that arise when people think about their future selves looks a lot like the patterns of activity that arise when people think about another person. Psychologically, what's happening there? We are seeing our distant selves, whether that's 5 years, 10 years, 20, whatever it may be. We're seeing those future selves as if they are other people. And the reason that I think that is so interesting, even just beyond the fact that like, wow, that's sort of strange. The reason that that's interesting is because it says something about why it's sometimes so hard to make decisions that have consequences now and later. Because ultimately, and I'm sure we'll unpack this more, but ultimately, if we think about our future selves as if they are other people, then by definition, any decision that we make right now that has a consequence later is going to happen essentially to another person, at least on an emotional level, on a neural level, on some psychological level.
If we're thinking of it as like, oh, this is not me, this is another person, how does that play into us making ethical decisions or financial behavior?
It's funny. When I started a lot of this research, I was really just focused on financial decisions. And then at some point, someone, a mentor pointed out to me, this is about so much more than that. The ethical decisions is so interesting, right? Because, and a lot of times people don't necessarily think about it this way, but, ethical decisions often are also these types of decisions that have trade-offs now and later. The shortcut, the ethical shortcut, is the one that's more satisfying right now. I think the modern version of this is did you use AI to do the thing that you probably should have done yourself, right? And of course there's all sorts of nuance there, right? And the reward is I've gotten this thing done pretty quick. The long-term possible consequence, and I say possible, the long-term possible consequence is you get caught. People trust you less and, your reputation gets damaged and so on. And I think what's really interesting about this is that, when we say ethical decisions, like I'm not saying like, do you murder someone or not, right? But there's all these little opportunities we have in our daily lives, our personal lives and our professional lives, where we could just shave the edges off a little bit and make things easier for ourselves. But then we run the risk of this punishment later on. By the way, it's not, these sorts of trade-offs, they're not just about, doing the virtuous thing now and, or the vice, the thing with vice. These sorts of trade-offs also are, pertain to our decisions about how we spend our time. A lot of us, especially professionally, you get these trade-offs between having to do, the urgent things or the important ones. And the urgent ones are the ones that like almost feel good to take care of right now. It's like, I'm sure you've had the experience of like, I'm checking off the list, I'm doing the thing, and your day finishes and you're like, yep, I did finish all of my emails or whatever it is. But like, then you look at your bigger projects and you're like, I made zero progress on that. And that's like another one of those sorts of short-term, long-term trade-offs that I think we battle a lot.
A longitudinal study found that people with a better future self connection reported higher life satisfaction 10 years later. Is that true?
Yeah. So this was a study that I conducted with my colleagues, Joey Reef and Jordy Quadbach. No, I should be clear. We did not track people. We ourselves didn't track people for 10 years. We got lucky and found a data set that had, in fact, tracked people for 10, actually more than 10 years. Um, but what was particularly relevant to us is that, at one point in time, they had asked people um, how similar they felt like they were to their future selves. They asked them how satisfied they were with their lives right then. And then 10 years later, they followed up with these folks. And then again, asked them how satisfied they were with their lives. So what that allowed us to do is to say, well, how how do things how much does it matter how similar I think of myself to my future self in terms of how satisfied I'll be later? And what we found, and I'm making this kind of high level, not talking about the details, although I'm happy to, but what we found, generally speaking, is that the people who felt more of a sense of similarity with their future selves 10 years later were the ones who were more satisfied with their lives. Now, what we don't know from that is, well, why does that happen? Now, my suspicion is that the people who feel similar to their future selves are the ones who are doing things that will put their future selves in a good position, which will then create more satisfaction later on. That is, I have to sort of like, put my social scientist hat on and say, like, that's my speculation. We can't actually sort of like prove that one out, but that's what we think is happening under the hood there.
This I found really interesting. This line: instead of there being a central self at our core, we are instead an aggregation of separate, distinct selves. You are actually a we. Could you speak to that?
Yeah. So, I mean, look, I should, I want to give credit where credit's due. These are ideas that, I mean, to some extent have been floating around for millennia.
Claim them. They're yours. They're yours.
I'll take it. It started with me and was not influenced by any philosophers. Look, there's been philosophers who have been talking about the sort of the nature of personal identity, which is it feels like such a sort of, esoteric topic in a way, but it becomes a really important one when you start thinking about decision making. That there's a thought experiment that you can run. I could say to you, Duncan, are you the same now as you were when you were 10 years old? And well, you say no right away. And it's funny because, I've probably gotten annoying with this. I've asked lots of people this over the years, probably hundreds if you think about the people that have been in my classrooms. And there's always people who say no. There's some people who are like, yes. I actually had one guy once who was like, yep, I still only eat chicken nuggets. I was like, okay, all right, man. But but what's interesting about this is it's like most people after their initial knee-jerk response are like, well, okay, no, I'm not, but my name is the same. And like, I mean, you're an interesting case because you're living in different places and your life is probably very different, but you can probably start to say, well, at the core, there's some things, and you quickly
Sure.
realize this is a really hard question to answer. I frankly have a very hard time with it. But one of the ways that I think psychologists and philosophers have figured out how to handle this question is to basically start by saying that's the wrong question. You can't really answer it. And a better way to answer it is to say, well, I'm not the same. Nor am I totally different. But here's what I can say. There's a bunch of versions of me, and there is a thread that connects those versions. And, there is the 10-year-old Duncan, and there's the 18-year-old Duncan, and then there's the you now, the 38-year-old Duncan, and and there's probably some thread that goes in between. And there's also probably some major differences too. And I think the reason I think this is an important one, and a lot of this, a lot of this sort of philosophical thinking uh, that was popularized about these ideas is from a British philosopher, Derek Parfit. The reason that this is important is because it suggests that what matters when we are making decisions for the future, um, it's not really, am I the same or will I be different? It's what aspects of me do I hope will still be present? Right now, I love playing tennis. I don't know if I'll still play tennis when I'm 65, 75, 85, but there's probably something about me that likes, for instance, being outside, doing something social, having some athletic activity. That's the string, and then the way that those values or that those interests get expressed could be very different depending on the stage of life I'm in. But right now I can say to you, I want those values to still be there. I really like, I'm lucky. I really actually like spending time with my kids most of the time, and I want that to still be something that's present. So I think this idea that that you are a we, that you're not at oneself. What that really boils down to practically is that when we make plans, I think it kind of frees us up to say, yeah, things will change, but there's going to be some things that we hope will remain the same. And then let's start asking ourselves, what are those things? What are the things that we want to last? What are the values that we want to be there in the future?
Do you find that freeing, less restrictive?
I do. Um, I do find it freeing. I find it freeing from, in a practical way, from a decision making standpoint. I think it's, suggests like it's okay if circumstances change. I think there's going to be aspects of me that are still that I valued in the past, that I value now, that will still be there. I think there's another way, and it's something that I've really thought about a lot in the last probably 3 or 4 years. Um, and it's this idea that this concept of this thread between selves. It's also freeing when it comes to thinking about dying, death, and I'm not saying I'm not trying to get too like dark or morbid here, but it was actually Parfit who he at one point said something like, "Once I realized that there's no single self, and what matters is this sort of like core values, then death became less scary because essentially there's a version of you that can continue to live on in others through the values and the stories and what you and that makes sense in some ways, right? I think that's an idea that's been expressed before, but when you start to really sit with that idea, I I think it makes the prospect, for me at least, it makes the prospect of my own mortality less scary. It's like this idea that like I'll end. Well, I think a version of me will stay. Um, I still have a hard time, thinking about the death of loved ones because fundamentally you can't interact with them. But but then so let's just like not ignore that. Like I don't want to like sugarcoat that. But then the idea that I can continue to sort of engage with the essence of somebody, I can continue to engage with the core of their personality that was their thread in different ways, whatever that means. I think that's comforting. And I'm again, I don't want to sound like, oh, death, who cares? Eh, But it's comforting in some way.
You were doing research where you were asking, what do people want more of? Do they want more time or do they want more money?
Yeah,
And
yeah.
you were wondering, what do those answers mean for people's happiness? And during that time, I think you were on a radio show and one of the listeners called in and asked you the question, like, how much time do we actually need? And it kind of stumped you a little bit. You were just like, I'm really good question. I'm not sure. How much time? What is the optimum amount of time we actually need? And what happened next?
Yeah. By the way, that was like one of those wild. I remember that moment. Because I was, this is research I've been doing with my friend and collaborator Cassie Holmes, who's also professor at UCLA, and we'd done this paper. We asked people these questions about how much time or money they have. We were on, it was like Wisconsin Public Radio. I remember, and they said, it was all right, we'll do this. It'll be fun. And I was in my office down on the fourth floor. She was in her office on the fifth floor. And we were like, all right, we'll just call in separately. And this guy calls in, just like he says, and he says, all right, well, you guys ask about, how much time do you want? Do you want time? Do you want money? Well, what's the right amount of time to have? And I remember just being like, I like texted her. I was like, this is our next project. Like, I don't know. And so it's funny because we ended up like right after that going to get coffee. And I was like, I don't think anyone knows this. And the analogy is, there's lots of research on how much money, how much is money linked to happiness, right? And there's this lengthy, decades long tradition of saying, there's debates, and there for a while, this idea was like, well, money matters for happiness up to a certain point, and then it levels off. And now it's a little bit more nuanced, the conclusions. But we sort of had a similar thought. It was like, well, first off, time is different than money because it's not, there's, uh, it's finite, right? Like you can't, money, you can just sort of accumulate more and it grows. But in each day, I only have a possible sum of 24 hours. And there's only so much of a lifespan that I can, I know there's a whole longevity movement, but within most of most people. So we set out to examine this, and there's fascinating data. There's like these really large scale data sets. One of my favorite ones is called the American Time Use Survey. And, can you imagine like what they do is they go and ask people, they'll call them and say like, tell me how you spent your day. But it's not like when you are with your girlfriend at night and you're like, how was your day? What'd you do? Oh, I did this and this. It's like, it's always funny when you think about that question. You're like, what did you do today? My wife's like, well, I had a couple, I did this. I met some friends. I had some patients. You're like, okay, what I'm accounting for now is a couple of hours. I have no idea about the rest of it. And the American Time Use Survey is basically like, okay, so from 9 to 9:10 a.m., what did you do then? All right, now let's go 9:10 to 9:20. Oh, you were on the phone and driving. We'll count that. And so you imagine for thousands of people, they've got data that's like that fine grained. And now what you can do from that is say, well, how much time did people have that was like theirs? That was like, well, we call it, a lot of social scientists call it discretionary. But what that means is time that's spent doing what I want to do. And then we also know from these folks, how happy are they? And so how satisfied are they with their lives? How meaningful they find their lives to be? And so what you can do from that statistically is you can say, all right, well, now let's look at the relationship between how much time people have and how happy they are. And I can dig into this more, but part of this that we spent something like 6 to 9 months on was like, what does it mean to have discretionary time? Because boy, that is not an easy, it's like, if I'm bathing my kid, is that discretionary? Like, it's not, because discretionary time is not, it's like people originally like, oh, 9 to 5 is working and the rest of the time is discretionary. It's like, oh, no, it's not, right? Because there's a lot of stuff where you're like, it's an obligation. Talking to you right now, this is discretionary. It's like, I wanted to do this. I think you wanted to do this. Yeah, this is fun. What we found was really, I thought it was really interesting. There's like, if you can imagine it, there's basically this upside down U where it's like too little time, not good for happiness. No one's surprised by that. It's like you think of the banker, the young law firm associate who's in the office from 8 a.m. to 12 at night and then goes to sleep and wakes up and does it again. Not good for happiness. And then there's kind of this like, middle ground. It's like, I mean, in our data set, what we found was like anywhere from 2 to 5 hours was like the sweet spot for discretionary time and happiness. But like, I want to just caution that that's like one data set. I don't know that like translates. But what was really interesting is that after a period of about 5 hours, you start to see this dip in happiness. And by the way, this is not just like, oh, that's unemployed people. No, this was employed, unemployed, weekend, weekday. If I have almost too much free time, that's not great. The one caveat, and I think it's an important one, is that if you sort of isolate the data and you say, all right, let's just look at the people who are spending their free time doing things that we know relate to happiness. They're spending it with other people. or they're doing things that are deemed productive by them, right? And I think we all know that. Like me, if I'm 1.5 hours on Instagram, like not productive. And what was interesting is that when you just look at the people who are spending their free time in those ways, now you don't see that sort of leveling off. It's just like more free time with others, productive, etc., is linked to more happiness. So I think that, if you want a punchline, the punchline is it's really not like the amount of time we have, and it's how you spend it. There's something that says, oh, of course, but like what's funny about that is that how often do we end up, sort of squandering away time? And by the way, like, just because I study this stuff doesn't mean I'm immune to it. I've
Mm,
my
yeah.
wife was out of town 2 weekends ago, and I was like, the kids went to sleep, and I was like, oh, I'm gonna watch this show I want to catch up on. Maybe I'll read. My God, how much time did I just? It's just like some of the videos on Instagram were very funny that night, but why did I just like? It's all, it's just lost time, you know. But so it goes.
When you're talking about 2 hours, 5 hours, I can also imagine there being a big influence from the culture or the environment or the fishbowl that the people are in. So say, for
Yeah,
example, you're in a culture where there's very much like a go, go, go hustle culture. Work is meaning, work hard, whatever, like get up at the crack of dawn, this. And then if you are not, if you've got a huge amount of disposable time, then I can imagine there being more, I don't know, self-flagellation versus if you're in a culture where the culture holds this idea of more slowness. The reason why I thought about that was
hmm,
because I once interviewed years ago a guy called Meek Viking. He's the CEO of the Danish, I think it's called the Happiness Research Institute in Copenhagen. And he once did a TED talk called The Dark Side of Happiness. And he was talking about something called the happiness suicide paradox. And so everyone often talks about Copenhagen, Danish as, one of the happy, consistently 1, 2, or 3 on like all happiness
yeah,
indexes,
sure,
really happy country. And so it'd be easy to assume or to think that because they are one of the happiest countries in the world, they also have one of the, when you look at the suicide rates, they would be right down at the bottom. And he said, well, actually, no, they're often somewhere around, I can't remember exactly what he said, let's say
sure,
just around the middle. And he's like, why is that? And one of the reasons he spoke about is that if you get up every day and everyone around you is happy, it's basically the equivalent of like summer every day. Everyone is like at the park with friends. And if you are struggling, if you have mental health issues, if you are not doing so well, then it'll be the containers a lot more visible and in your face. And so actually, paradoxically, the suicide rates are not like right down at the bottom. And so I
yeah,
found that really, really
yeah.
interesting.
Oh, I think this is such a fascinating line of discussion because you're right. It's sort of like, I don't know this paper. I know I've heard the data point that, there's some spike in suicides on it was something like there's spike in suicides on sunny days. If I can't even be happy when it's beautiful outside, what
Uh,
I want to check that because I'm not positive that that's just, sort of a myth. But but back to your point though about time, you're right that the culture that we're in has a huge influence on our psychology, on our judgments of what we're doing, on the norms, and also on sort of like our own markers of success and are we doing the things we're supposed to be doing. If everybody around me is going a million miles an hour, then even 1.5 hours of discretionary time to me might like seem like I'm not keeping up with my peers, which we know is an important. I mean, we're just so fundamentally social that that comparison, that yardstick, could be quite meaningful.
think the when you use that park analogy, it's the word I just wrote down was should underlined. It's in like when there's this idea that I should be happy, or I should be happy, or I should be enjoying this moment. Not only I read a really interesting book about the history of happiness from the ancient Greeks through to the modern days, and how the way that we think about it has changed. So from, the ancient Greeks, felicitas was this idea of like luck. You needed luck or chance or fortune.
Huh.
It was up to the gods whether you could be happy or not. The church, was this idea of happiness was delayed to the promise of the afterlife. Since the Enlightenment, it's this idea that, we are the masters of our own ship. We can be happy. We should be happy. Sometimes there's this expectation of like, I should be happy. Why am I not happy? And if you're not happy, you're doing something wrong. You're not doing anything wrong, but there's this flagellation, which I think is really, it's super problematic.
Yeah, it's so interesting you say that, because it's also like, that's got me thinking about like, what are the cultural differences? What are the generational differences? What does that feel like as a teen? Those are really important questions to be looking at, because it because it matters.
Surrogation over simulation. Why should we surrogate rather than simulate?
I love that. Yeah, so this is work that's some of Dan Gilbert. Dan Gilbert's a Harvard psychology professor. It's some of his work. Here's the question. If I'm trying to decide on some course of action, should I go into this career? Should I move to this city? Should I take this trip? Should I date this person? When we try to make those decisions, what we're fundamentally doing is trying to anticipate how we'll feel after we've moved to the city, chosen the career, dated the person, and so on. And so what that means, I don't think people really think about this. No one says, well, before I decide, what's the best way to decide, right? We just do it. We say, well, I know I can take a pretty good guess. I mean, it's like the really basic version of this is like when you go to a restaurant, no one says to you, how are you going to decide what to order? It's like, I'm going to look at the menu and decide whether I think this is something I'll like, and what you're doing there is you're simulating. You are trying to imagine, when I take a bite of the steak, is that the type of thing I will like? Okay. Now, when it comes to bigger decisions, you ask people, all right, for instance, dating, look at a bunch of dating profiles. What's the best way to decide who to date? Should you try to guess, or do you think it might make sense to talk to other people who've gone on dates with these same folks? And people are like, well, I think I'll try to guess. Like, I know myself. But what Gilbert and his collaborators did is they actually do this. They run this speed dating type of research study. And most people say, well, when I'm trying to make a guess about how satisfied I'll be dating this person, I'll just predict based on the information I see on their profile. And then for some other people, they actually have some folks already go on dates with these guys. And then the research participant says, well, I can read the dating profile and I can also look at what other people, said. And then folks go on dates. And the best predictor of dating satisfaction is not your own predictions, but rather other people's experiences with those partners. And it's a really funny finding and disconnect, because we want to think that we are, like you said, like the masters of our own domain. We want to think that we know ourselves. We want to think that we actually can predict how we'll feel about things. The only hitch there is that we're actually quite bad at doing that. We're bad at making predictions about our future feelings. And somebody who's like us, who's gone through something similar, oftentimes it's a pretty good barometer for whether we'll like that same thing. We don't want to believe that, by the way. We don't want to believe that because we want to think that we are unique. We're somehow different. It's like, today, by the way, I went to it was like a parents' coffee thing, and there was like 45, 50 people there. And I looked across the way, and there was this dad, and he was wearing a gray sweater, blue jeans, white sneakers. Not saying that I was like so unique, but I was like, any hope that I was unique is dashed by the fact that, like, at my very school, there's a guy across the way who's literally wearing the exact same. I texted him, I'm like, love your outfit today. And he starts writing yes, and then looks up and he's like, oh. And it's like, you want to think you're unique. So you want to think that certainly someone else couldn't predict how you'll feel. And in reality, so many people have been through the same things that we have. This isn't just about dating. It's about life. It's about big decisions. Sometimes there's a lot of value in having a surrogate, somebody who's gone through the experience and tapping into their experience to make a prediction about ours rather than just simulating alone. I think that's the takeaway there.
Why do you think we don't do it more?
I think it's a couple things. I mean, I think one, we have to bring the culture part back into it because I think, we're sort of raised in Western cultures where individualism is valued. I do question whether or not that same desire not to have somebody else make my predictions would be present in a more interdependent, more collectivist culture. So I do think that's a big part of it, that we kind of want to stand out. We want to say, I am unique. I am me. There's no one like me. I also think as long as there have been multiple generations of people alive at the same time, there has been the desire to separate ourselves from people who are our parents' generation. I think that then also plays out in sort of surrogation as well. It's like, I don't want someone to tell me. I mean, it's like the worst thing that a teenager can hear is a parent telling them what this career path or what this thing will be like. Well, to you, not me. Now, I do wonder though, we've sort of moved into this interesting space where I trust complete strangers' perspectives online to tell me recommendations for travel, restaurants, doctors, all these things. Oftentimes more so than I might trust someone I know, because I'm like, well, you know, they're not totally like me, but if I can find a site or community of people that I think are like-minded, well, I'm going to trust them. I don't know anything about them other than some maybe demographic characteristics. I'm also curious whether Gen AI will start to change this tendency as well, right? So here's an example. I trust Spotify's recommendations. I'm not paid by Spotify. This is not a plug for them, but what Spotify is effectively doing is saying when they make a playlist recommendation to me, what they're doing is saying, there's people like you who have listened to some of the same bands, and then here's a set of bands that they've listened to that you haven't. Also, by the way, here's, I mean, they can also do this by saying like, well, what sounds the same, but some of it is also saying like, what do people choose? That's effectively saying like, let's put some surrogation into action. I trust that, and I'm like very much dialed into that. My like Discover playlist is that. A couple years ago, I wrote this essay about like, well, like what if I could get like a almost Gen AI, like, simulation of me that's informed by lots of other people who have been like me, and ask him, um, how do you feel after doing this thing? I don't know, man. I mean, it sounds a little sci-fi, but I think I'd buy into that, and I don't think I don't think it's the type of sci-fi that won't happen. I think that's like, we're already there with simulated agents. Like, who's to say that we can't do that for ourselves?
That's the perfect segue into your collaboration with MIT, your
Yeah.
Future You project. To
Yeah. Yeah.
anyone who's not aware, what was the thinking behind that, and can you tell us?
Yeah. Yeah. Sure. Sure. I mean, basically just a phenomenal team there, and we together, and it was really led by them, that created this Future You platform that basically asks you a bunch of questions about yourself right now and uses those questions to inform and then create a Future You chatbot. And then you basically sit there and have a conversation with your future self. Now, of course, yeah, it's not really, we didn't invent time travel. It's not really your future self. And I will tell you that when I first tested it, I thought, well, I don't know. I was skeptical. And the reality was I got lost in it. I got lost in it quickly. It's, it creates this very interesting experience of, on the one hand, knowing I'm not really talking to my future self. On the other hand, it allows you to sort of like imagine like, well, what what if I actually could? Like, what would I be asking? What would I want to know? My suspicion is that just being able to ask those questions, just being able to say to yourself, what would I want to know? And then sort of being forced in, not being forced, but being in a situation where it's natural to write down those questions, it prompts you to think differently about your own future and your own future self. And, right now, it's actually, it's available to anybody who wants to use it, but we're still modifying it. But one of the findings we found is that it actually people who use it, younger people especially, experience like a slight reduction in anxiety about the future. And my suspicion is that part of what's happening there is that it's really anxiety is about spinning out, worrying about things that haven't happened. Having the conversation with your future self, it doesn't make any of these things happen or not happen, but it does force you to stop spiraling and start sort of dealing with them, talking about them. So I'm excited about it. I think it'll be interesting to see where we go with it.
My coaching clients are predominantly startup founders. Could a future self intervention help CEOs make less fear driven decisions? And if so, how would you design that for a high stakes leader?
Oh, man, that's a fascinating question. I, I think it's such an interesting question because on the one hand, you could imagine that having someone really sort of like step out of the present and connect to their future self could actually make them more hesitant. You could imagine them sort of focusing more on saying, oh man, but like, what if this doesn't work out? I want to take care of my future self, you know? I, I think that more than that though, what I would almost want to see a conversation with a future self do for someone in that sort of position is make them focus more on what they'll regret or not regret. So in other words, I'm moving a little bit away from the sort of like fear driven or, making or not making fear driven decisions, and more to the question of like, if I really step into the shoes of my future self and I say it's 20 years from now, I'm now looking back on this period of time. What does that future version of me wish I had done? What is he glad I didn't do? And I'm curious if that sort of conversation might change the dynamic a little bit. One of the things we know from the regret literature is that people, okay, if I ask you right now, like tell me something you regret from a week ago, most often what people list are actions that they took, things that they did. Ugh, man, I wish I hadn't said that thing. If you zoom ahead and you ask people later on, what did you regret 10 years ago? Now the things people regret with time are inactions, not the actions. Because it's very interesting because something I did caused a known path. Something I didn't do leaves open a possibility of several unknown paths that branch and branch and branch. And I'm curious if getting people to connect, getting the types of folks you're talking about to connect to their future selves, and also in doing so, think about the decisions that they're making now or not making now and how they'll feel about those decisions later on. I wonder if it might prompt more people into action and away from the sort of safe inaction space.
Yeah, interesting. I have no idea.
I don't know. I mean, it's an open question.
Mhm.
That's why I say I'm sort of cautious because depending on where someone's at, is that you could imagine it going different ways. Look, I have got when I teach my MBAs, the average age is 28. Some of those MBAs are going for it with entrepreneurial ventures, and they can in a way because it's like they're not no one they're not this is their time to just do the thing. If they waited 10 years, it's suddenly the decision to sort of like work all the time and put everything into a startup becomes a different decision. And I'm not saying you should or shouldn't do it, but it's like there's just more consequences there because oftentimes there's more people who are dependent on you, right? And so I think that's why I sort of say like, well, I'm curious how those conversations with the future self might push somebody into something or away from something. And it might be depending on like what else is going on for them, where they are at in their life stage.
What mental models or frameworks do you personally lean on the most to improve your decision making?
This a couple months ago, my grandmother died. She was 101 and a half, so it was sad, but it was like incredible. She lived this really long life. And she died at the end of July. And I had to get this like sinus surgery that I'd been waiting for months. And it was like, it was scheduled on like a Monday. My grandmother dies. Her funeral is going to be that Sunday, like literally a day before, on the East Coast. I'm on the West Coast. And, my wife and I are like, well, we got to go. I want to go. It's cutting it close, but like, I really want to do this. So we wake up to fly there, and there's like massive storms on the East Coast, like these like incredible, thunderstorms, etc. And my wife is like, what do you want to do? Like, do you still want to go? And I said, hold on a second. Let's just think about this for a second. If we go and we get stuck there and I miss my surgery, what's going to happen is that I'm going to have to wait out 2 more months to get it. And that's going to suck because I was like having all these issues, and that's going to suck. But if we stay here because I'm worried about missing my surgery, then I will surely miss the funeral. And I was like, if I zoom ahead 10 years, what am I going to remember? And I was like, I am going to really not care that I had to wait 2 more months, because at the end of the day, I would have gone to the funeral and gotten the surgery. But if I stay here and miss the funeral just so that I can be sure to have the surgery right now, all I'll remember in 10 years is that I missed the funeral. And I was like, and everybody has different values on these things. Like, there's people who say the funeral doesn't matter as much as the fact that you got to say goodbye, etc. But for me, I knew that what I really wanted to do is have that closure and be there. And it was the most freeing moment, because I've always been somebody who's a little bit indecisive at times. And this would be one of those moments I would be particularly indecisive in, because there's like no right answer, and there's a high pressure moment and you've got to decide. And it was amazing because I said, look, here's the deal. I'm going to regret it a lot more if I miss the funeral. I just want to try this. And my wife was like, done, let's do it. And it was like, it just made life so much easier to do that. And the funny thing was, we got there, we had this meaningful time with my family. We get on the plane to come back home, and I'm like, okay, I can take a sigh of relief. It's like 4 p.m. on the East Coast. We pull away from the gate, and all of a sudden goes, ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. There's a thunderstorm on the horizon and the airport has been shut down. And I was like, no. I was like about to say to my wife, okay, we made it. And I was like, you know what? I'm going to wait till we're in the air. And it was sure enough. And it was like, we were on the ground for 2 hours just sitting on the plane. And like, eventually we took off and all was good. It was amazing. But I was like, oh my God, it almost was like just down to the wire there. So good.
Hal, this has been such a fun conversation. Thank you so much thank you for imparting these fascinating studies, for chatting, for the stories. I've really enjoyed it. It's been a real treat.
Hey, it's same. It's been my pleasure. Really nice to talk to you, Duncan. Thank you.
How can people where can, an Amazon, your future self, a website, where can we send people to find out more about you and your work?
Yeah, halhershfield.com's got all of it. The books on Amazon, anywhere else you can buy books, and all the updates are there. LinkedIn as well. But thank you.